We start at the G7 summit in the English county of Cornwall, where there's been a key diplomatic announcement. The White House has confirmed that the gathering of leaders have launched a plan to build infrastructure in the world's poorer nations, a direct response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Lots to discuss. Let's get more with my colleague Ben Brown, who's in Cornwall for us.
Yes, hello, we're here at Tregenna Castle here in Cornwall. It's the resort in St Ives in the southwest of England, which is currently hosting the world leaders for this G7 summit. Day two, an absolutely beautiful day for the leaders here and a beautiful view for them to look out onto as they discuss world events and world issues. They are focusing particularly today on how to prevent future pandemics with a global early warning system for new viruses. And they're also looking very much at how to counter China's growing influence in the world. But particularly on the mind of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson this weekend is the key decision he has to make by Monday about whether or not to lift remaining coronavirus restrictions in England on June the 21st. Well, he's been talking to the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, in the last few hours, and he said the government has to proceed with caution.
Well, what I can certainly say is that we're looking at the data and continue to do that. We'll be saying more on Monday when the decision comes due. But I think what you can certainly take it, Laura, is that the roadmap was always cautious but irreversible. And in order to have an irreversible roadmap, you've got to be cautious, and we'll be spelling out exactly what we'll be doing on Monday. Now, I'm afraid you'll have to wait till Monday to get the full picture.
But it sounds like you're basically saying to people they are going to have to be patient, because what you want to avoid is going ahead and then having to back out.
So we want to have a cautious but irreversible roadmap. We've made a massive progress with the vaccination programme. It's done a huge amount of good. But you've got to be cautious in order to deliver an irreversible roadmap.
I'm hearing very clearly that there is going to be a delay of some description.
You wait to see what we say on Monday.
Boris Johnson there talking to Laura Kuenssberg. Well, partly overshadowing this summit here in Cornwall are the simmering tensions over the post-Brexit trade deal between Britain and the European Union about how it affects Northern Ireland. And there have been some key bilaterals in the last few hours here in Cornwall. Now, Boris Johnson talked at breakfast time this morning to the French President Emmanuel Macron. According to the French side, Mr Macron said he wants to reset Franco-British relations, but only if the UK, he said, respects the Brexit agreement that it struck with the EU. Mr Johnson also sat down this morning with the outgoing German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and they too discussed how that post-Brexit trade arrangement affects Northern Ireland. Prime Minister told the BBC on this issue there needs to be pragmatism and also compromise on both sides.
I think, to be fair, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding around the EU about the situation in Northern Ireland, the balance of the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and I was just in a gentle way getting across what that means and I think that we'll have some pragmatic solutions. And if we don't, then I think that what our friends have also understood is that it's the prime duty of the UK government to uphold the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. And that's what we're going to do. And we'll do whatever it takes to ensure that.
Prime Minister speaking there to Laura Kuenssberg. Well, let's talk to the BBC's deputy political editor, Vicky Young. Let's just pick up on what he was saying there about his bilateral talks on that Northern Ireland issue. Vicky, he said we'll do whatever it takes, and there's been some pretty robust rhetoric on both sides. To what extent is that overshadowing this summit?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what does he mean by that? Now, he talks about protecting the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. There are many who would say that he was warned very strongly before he signed that Brexit deal back in December that actually what he was proposing would effectively split off Northern Ireland in a regulatory sense from the rest of the United Kingdom. That's why the DUP, the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, refused to accept it, because they didn't want to be treated differently. Lots of people people foresaw the problem that goods going from the rest of the United Kingdom, that's Scotland, England and Wales, into Northern Ireland would need checks, because Northern Ireland is still following a lot of EU rules. So the question is, what will he do about that? Now, is he suggesting there that the UK would be willing to effectively suspend the whole thing and not go along with what was signed before? Remember also that the EU has already launched legal action against the United Kingdom for the way that they have implemented, or really not implemented, some of the part of the protocol, some of those checks, because the UK decided, without agreeing in advance with the EU, that they would extend the grace period where those checks were being waived. They've done that on their own without talking to the EU about it, and that has just inflamed tensions. So really the question now is, how do they find a way through this? Now, it won't get solved here, but I think the fact that that meeting with the EU leaders was dominated by this issue, Emmanuel Macron talking about resetting the relationship between the French and between the United Kingdom, but saying that really did depend on the UK keeping to its word. That's how the EU view this. They would say to Boris Johnson, you signed this, you knew what you were doing, and now you've got to stick to it. On the other side, Boris Johnson talking about, as they all do, the peace process, and making sure, of course, because that's the reason that this very complicated negotiation was brought about in the first place. He would say, yes, this is about the peace process, and you've got to remember that in Northern Ireland, on the Unionist side, there's a lot of disquiet and unhappiness about what's going on, and as they would say, it's about how this is being implemented. It's not about the deal itself, it's about how it's being put into practice. They both talk about having pragmatic solutions to all of this. The trouble is they don't agree on what they are.
Right, let's just talk about what he was saying also about June the 21st and whether or not to lift restrictions. He got a big decision to make on that. A lot of people suspect he's already made that decision, and it is to delay June the 21st, maybe by a month.
Yeah, I mean, that is the suggestion, that this is certainly being considered a delay of up to 4 weeks. Remember, Boris Johnson always said it was going to be about data, not dates. Now, we can all see the data. Most of it is out there publicly. Cases are rising. We know that the Delta variant, which started in India, is more transmissible. Cases are going up. Now, people expected that because, of course, lots of restrictions have already been lifted. There is some suggestion that that link between cases and hospitalisations has certainly been dented, if not broken. On the good news, 2 vaccines gives you a huge amount of protection, even against this variant. It's not 100%. But it's a lot of protection. Even 1 vaccine can give you a lot of protection. So you can see the advantage of delaying by even 4 weeks, because in that time, millions more people will have more protection. Now, you really get the impression this is the way that the government is going. I think the question is going to be, how long will the delay be? Will there be any exemptions, for example, for weddings? Will they look at outside events and treat them differently? We know that the virus doesn't transmit in the same way outside as it does indoors. All those things, I think, of course, still being considered. Boris Johnson, heavy hints there. I think there will be some kind of delay, but we won't know for sure until Monday evening.
All right, Vicky, many thanks indeed. Vicky Young there, our Deputy Political Editor. Let me tell you that Joe Biden is currently meeting Emmanuel Macron of France. And there they are in the Cornwall sunshine, enjoying the views, no doubt. I wonder if they are talking about the Northern Ireland issue that we've just been discussing with Vicky. Joe Biden and his administration certainly have some pretty firm views on that we heard in the build-up to this summit, and Mr. Macron also has firm views on it, and he said that the EU agreement on a post-Brexit trade deal was not up for renegotiation. That was what he warned the British side before he left Paris for this summit. So Mr. Macron and Mr. Biden talking there. And one of the things Joe Biden in particular wants to be talking about today, not at this particular bilateral, but at the summit plenary sessions, is how America and indeed its allies can combat the growing influence around the world of China, and what America and its allies here at the G7 can do about that. Let's talk to our correspondent Nomia Iqbal, who's in Carbis Bay. And Nomia, for Joe Biden, this issue of China, very, very important. Of course, China is not part of the G7, even though it's such an enormous economy, but the G7 countries are worried about China's growing power in the world.
That's right. China is really on the mind of the US president, and he, to put it bluntly, doesn't want China to become the success story of the 21st century. And he is hoping that his G7 allies will see eye to eye with him. Now, this all comes down to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And just to remind people of what that is, this is central to China's foreign policy. And this was something China created in 2013, a huge spending infrastructure in which they have poured billions into 70 countries around the world, into railways and bridges and other transport infrastructure. And this has stretched from Asia to Africa to Europe. And the US administration is worried about this. They have called it unfair economic competition. They've accused China of using unfair practices, forced human labor, they say, and just to quote, they say the practices are an affront to human dignity. And Joe Biden wants to offer an alternative vision in which he says is more in line with the values of global democracies. And he's come up with this plan. He calls it Build Back Better World, and it's essentially an infrastructure financing mechanism that's designed to help poorer and lower income countries, middle income countries as well. Now, we don't know many details about this, so we don't know what the timeline is, the structure, who's going to even pay for it. So I imagine, those sort of details are the kind of things that he'll be talking to his G7 allies about. But will they get on board? Because a lot of his allies have deep economic ties with Beijing, particularly Germany, who has said that China is its trade partner and has been for 5 years. And of course, the UK cares as well about its relationship with China. Coming up in a few months, the UK will be hosting the Climate Change Conference. And it won't want to alienate China, especially considering that China is the world's biggest polluter. They will want to get them on board. China, has the world's second largest economy, but Joe Biden does not want them to be number one.
Nomia, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Nomia Iqbal there. Well, let's get the thoughts now of Dame Diane Julius, who is founder or member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, now Senior Fellow in Global Economy and Finance Programme at Chatham House, and a leading economist. Thank you very much for being with us. Just to pick up on those thoughts we were hearing about China and this whole concept of building back better after the pandemic. And Boris Johnson was talking yesterday about when the world builds back its economy, he wants a sort of levelling up agenda. He wants it to be a fairer distribution of wealth. What are your views on that? And can the G7 really make that happen?
Well, thank you, Ben. I think it's an effort by leaders of all sorts and stripes to turn this pandemic into some kind of opportunity. We do have to build back, and we certainly, if we're going to build back, we'd like to do it better. Whether it can actually happen, whether we can fulfill all of these rather high-sounding objectives, either with or without a lot of money, I think remains to be seen. It does seem to me that when the world looks back on this weekend, this G7 summit, and asks what were the big achievements, I suspect that it's going to be related to the decisions that they take on the global pandemic, on whatever the Corbis Bay Declaration turns out to be, because that's the key global issue at the moment. And these 7 countries only make up 40% now of world GDP, but they are the home of 2/3 of the global pharma industry. They're where the genomic capacity exists. And the urgency right now is really getting the pandemic under control. So I think that the infrastructure investment plan is an interesting idea. It's not clear to me how it differs from what the World Bank already does. But I think that actually what the G7 agree on how to vaccinate the world is going to be much more significant.
OK, and they've promised, and they are promising 1 billion vaccine doses, and they're promising a new global early warning system on the pandemic. But just on post-pandemic economic recovery, they are clearly, and Joe Biden is very clearly, as we were hearing there, worried about the growing influence on the global economy of China.
I think that's true, and I think it is also a worry, not just in the US, but also in the EU. The EU has now begun calling China a systemic rival. That's quite a confrontational objective way to categorize the China relationships. I suppose what Biden is trying to do in talking about infrastructure investment is to have a positive response to the threats that China brings to the G7. So far, we've heard a lot about the negative threats. There are trade tariffs. There are concerns about human rights. There are worries about the technological development of China, worries about Taiwan. These are all rather negative concerns, but major concerns. And I think they're not likely to go away. I suspect that behind the scenes, Biden and his administration would really like to see the Europeans line up with the US on responding to some of the competitive concerns that have to do really with the developed countries, not just the Belt and Road developing countries.
And just one other question, which is, even before the summit began, in the build-up to it, of course, we saw this agreement amongst the G7 finance ministers about reforming corporation tax, on how to tax the big corporations of the world. Was that an important step forward, do you think, in your view?
I think it was an important step forward. It was an unexpected step. Certainly under the Trump administration, there was not support at all for reforming global taxation. But this is a moment where one of the elements that can come through Building Back Better is making sure that the largest global corporations do pay their fair share of taxes. And I think that all of those involved in this at the OECD and elsewhere have been aware for a long time that the amount of tax that the global corporations have been paying has been declining as a share of GDP for over 10 years now. And much of that is due to the tax havens and the very complicated structure of taxation that corporates have. So if indeed we can get this implemented with some sort of global agreement on a minimum tax rate, and sharing the proceeds of the corporate taxes with countries where those companies do business, not necessarily where they're headquartered, it will be a very bold step forward. I think the difficulty is that, of course, there are a number of both corporates and countries, tax havens in particular, who will oppose this. So we'll have to see what happens. This is still the first act of the play. We still have the July meetings of the G20 finance ministers. We have the OECD involved. So it's an important first step. I don't think that many people expected the G7 summit to do much more than endorse what their finance ministers said. So it's not a big focus of this summit, but it is indeed a very important step forward.